June 1961. NASA has scheduled 3 more Redstone tests. But Al Shepard's flight is felt to have been so successful that Mercury management decides to go with just 1 more. Taking place on July 21st, it proves to be something more than a routine repeat of Al Shepard's ride in the sky.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
Again, this is the voice of Colonel John Shorty Powers. The actual countdown is being made by Al Shepard, now serving as capsule communicator.
4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Liftoff. Lift. Mercury control and pilot.
Roger, this is Liberty Bell 7. The clock is operating.
Loud and clear, Jose. Don't cry too much.
Okie doke. Okay, it's a nice ride up to now.
Loud and clear.
Roger. Okay, the fuel is go, about 1 1/4 G's. Cabin pressure is just coming off the peg. The oxygen is go with 26 amps.
Roger, pitch 8A, trajectory is good.
Roger, looks good here.
This time, the man in the capsule, named Liberty Bell 7, is an Indiana Air Force captain, Virgil I. Grissom, called Gus by his friends.
It's such a fascinating view out the window, you just can't help but look out that way.
I understand.
Until the last moments, the mission goes exactly as planned, in a high curve 305 miles down the Atlantic Range to the open sea. And Shorty Powers calmly relays to the world a description of what is taking place.
We're advised that as a result of communications with Gus Grissom floating in the water, he's told his recovery helicopters that he intends to finish his checklist and make sure that everything is secure in the cockpit before he opens the hatch to come out. And this sounds like typical Gus Grissom. He was not about to do anything until he was sure everything had been done and in a businesslike manner.
Then, suddenly, for some reason never established to this day,
So I was all set, waiting for him, laid back down on the couch. He gave me a call. He was on final, and I knew he'd be in to pick me up in about 10 or 15 seconds. I was just laying there minding my own business, and then pow! The hatch went. I looked up, and I saw nothing but blue sky and water starting to come in over the sill. So I tossed my helmet off, and the only 2 moves I remember making was tossing my helmet off and grabbing the instrument panel and pulling myself out. I only remember grabbing the instrument panel. I don't even remember going out the door. But the chopper pilot said the door came off immediately, followed by myself.
Grissom is in the water. He's near to drowning when a helicopter gets to him and hauls him to safety. Meanwhile, the sea is pouring into the capsule, increasing its weight, overheating the engine of another helicopter that is trying desperately to lift it to safety. The helicopter is forced finally to cut loose and let the capsule sink beneath the waters, with all the precious records of the flight. Later, Gus will say,
Well, I was scared a good portion of the time. I guess this is a pretty good indication.
an unbelieving reporter asks,
Scared. Okay? I've been scared a few times before.
it is Gus's destiny, as it will be again 5.5 years later, at the cost of his life, to demonstrate that the road to the moon is filled with mortal danger. How does a woman feel whose husband has chosen to travel this road? Reen Carpenter, speaking for all the wives of astronauts.
I've been with 17 women in the first hour after they've lost their husband in a violent crash. These men were test pilots before they were astronauts. They were career men before they were test pilots. They are professional career officers. They have always lived a life of service to their country. When I married him, I knew that his country and his duty came first and his flying came first. It's always been orders first, women and children last.
August 1961. Following Grissom's flight, vast and cautious preparations go forward to what must be our next stage, putting a man in orbit around the Earth, as the Russians did months back with Yuri Gagarin. For this, we will make the capsule to the second rocket we've been testing, which by now has been man-rated for spaceflight. This is the Air Force's ICBM, the Atlas, 5 times as powerful as Redstone.
This is Radio Moscow.
But before we can cut down the 1-lap lead of the Russians, they suddenly lap us a second time. For on August 5th, 1961, a 26-year-old Soviet major, German Titov, takes off in his spaceship Vostok 2. Traveling at 18,000 miles an hour, compared to the maximum 5,310 of Gus Grissom, he circles the Earth 17 times. During his 25 hours and 18 minutes in the air, he travels 435,000 miles, almost far enough to go to the moon and back.
Вас понял. Очень рады, что все идет отлично.
Major Titov addressed greetings to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, the Soviet government, and Premier Khrushchev. Everything was going fine, he said. He felt excellent, and all the apparatus on the spaceship was functioning normally.
With a grin, the handsome, wavy-haired cosmonaut declares, "This is Eagle." A worried U.S. senator speculates, quote, that a satellite of this size could be utilized as a very dangerous weapon, unquote. Chairman Nikita Khrushchev declares that Titov's feat has shown once again what Soviet man, educated by the Communist Party, is able to do. Riding high on a wave of world prestige, the Soviets suddenly take the offensive on other fronts. 5 days after Titov's flight, East Germany closes the border between East and West Berlin and starts building a wall. The struggle of East and West takes on another form. In October, despite world protests, Russia sets off nuclear blasts of 25 and 50 megatons, the largest man-made explosions in history. In Huntsville, Alabama, Von Braun and his rocket crew, now part of NASA, are looking 9 years ahead. They're developing fantastically huge engines for the Saturn rocket, which has been designated for our eventual moonshots. Again, there is criticism.
But we have a large capacity which is not being used in the production of smaller boosters.
Dr. Arthur Kantrowitz, a leading space authority, offers what he considers a shortcut to the moon. At a public forum of the American Rocket Society, he asks, why wait years to develop the Saturn engines? We could get to the moon faster by starting to work right now using less powerful rockets, the ICBMs already in our stockpile. First, we would develop techniques to rendezvous in orbit. Second, we would build a way station in space and use this as our jumping off point to the moon.
Dr. Kantrowitz, I think I can comment on this.
Werner von Braun replies.
Studied. If you remember this figure of 400,000 pounds initial weight needed in orbit to put a crew of 3 men to the moon, you are really talking about something like 100 ICBM launches to put that initial payload together in orbit, and this becomes a logistics problem like flying the Berlin airlift with Piper Cubs. Nobody can say it can't be done, but it is certainly very
If that were the quickest way of doing it, and we had Piper Cubs, should we wait until we develop DC-6s to do it with?
Well, we think within the total framework of time available here, these 9 years or 8 years that we have, I would put my money on the DC-6s.
As if I may...
On November 29, 1961, a month later, we make a final test of our not-so-reliable Air Force Atlas designated as Mercury Atlas V. We send into orbit a chimpanzee named Enos, the Greek word for man. By now, we've developed a vast worldwide team of specialists who, in MA5, are being given one final living rehearsal before we attempt to shoot a man into orbit. It includes a tracking network, which has grown from 4 to 18 stations around the globe. They, too, have been practicing, as Niles Heller, in charge of operations at the Goddard Space Flight Center, tells us.
An actual mission with all the realism, but not including a capsule in the orbit, is included. Whoever developed these simulations must be a morbid individual by nature. We have simulated everything from a cardiac failure of the astronaut to a nuclear attack in which all communications must be suspended. These exercises develop in the personnel and
Enos is being closely watched all the way. Suddenly, the monitoring instruments report trouble. His cabin is cold, his fuel is low, and one of the motors controlling the attitude of the capsule is malfunctioning. Chris Kraft calls a warning to his team.
Activity on 69 and 70. You got 12 seconds.
12 seconds in which to make a decision. Enos may not live through another orbit. It must be decided now whether to terminate the flight. 2 months from now, an astronaut may find himself in just such a situation.
Roger, therefore we ought to bring it back in. All right, go ahead with retro fire. Roger.
In California, Arnold Ulrich presses a button.
2, 1, fire. Roger, retro's fired.
And Enos comes safely home. We know now that all systems are go for our first manned orbital flight. But minor mechanical difficulties and bad weather keep John Glenn grounded through 8 postponements, including one in which he sits waiting vainly for 5 hours in his capsule, named Friendship 7 by a vote of the entire Glenn family to symbolize the teamwork involved in spaceflight. Our national spirits sink. On February 14th, President Kennedy answers growing criticism of the Mercury program and the current delays.
Well, it is unfortunate. I know it's strange, Colonel Glenn. It has delayed our program. It puts burdens on all those who must make these decisions as to whether the mission should go or not. I think it's been very unfortunate. But I have taken the position that the judgment of those on the spot should be final in regard to this mission, and I'll continue to take that judgment. But I am quite aware of the strain it's caused everyone, and it's been a source of regret to everyone. But I think we ought to stick with the present group who are making the judgment, and they are hopeful still of having this flight take place in the next few days.
Finally, on the morning of February 20th, 1962, after 2 hours of holds for minor repairs, the checklist proceeds to its final stage.
Looks good, old man. Boy, can you imagine? Here we go. Hot dog, back to 1.
Status check, pressurization. Locks tanking. Have a blinking high level light. You are go. Water systems, go. Range operations. Mercury capsule, go. All pre-start panel lights are correct. The ready light is on. Eject Mercury umbilical. Oil evacuate. Mercury umbilical clear. Mercury evacuate. Lights on. All recorders too fast. T-minus 18 seconds.
There are last-second farewells.
May the wee ones be with good Lord ride all the way.
Godspeed, John Glenn. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway. Roger, we're
And the first American has taken off for orbit to circle the globe 3 times. 5 minutes and 1 second after liftoff, 100 miles above the Earth, explosive charges separate the capsule from its sustainer engine. At 17,500 miles per hour, the capsule races into orbit, which until now has belonged exclusively to the Russians. On his eastward course toward the oncoming tomorrow, he has the familiar and knowing voices of fellow astronauts to guide him. They're serving as capsule communicators. Al Shepard at Canaveral, Gus Grissom in Bermuda, Gordo Cooper in Australia, Wally Schirra in California.
Los micrófonos de la voz de los Estados Unidos de América, colocados en la tribuna de prensa del Cabo Cañaveral, donde dentro de pocas horas...
The world stops its business to follow broadcasts and telecasts of the flight of Friendship 7 in Spanish, Italian, French, German, Chinese. In India, it's given top place over an important national election. In England, more people follow it than listened even to Churchill's wartime broadcasts. Here at home, 100 million Americans watch at 40 million television sets, including a giant screen set up in New York's Grand Central Station.
This is Mercury Control. We'd like to confirm the liftoff time as 9:45.
Where trains come and go half empty, while the travelers stand, journeying instead with John Glenn in space. 8 minutes after liftoff, he's halfway across the Atlantic, testing his controls and reporting on how they work.
Control so far is excellent. Very good. No problems at all so far on control. Roger.
7 minutes later, he's looking down through his window at Africa, catching sight of a huge dust storm and brush fires. As he leaves Africa, a medical officer on the island of Zanzibar asks him how he is adjusted to weightlessness.
This is Friendship 7. The head movements cause no sensations whatsoever.
Feel fine. Reach test, I can hit directly to any spot that I want to hit. I have no problem reaching for knobs and have adjusted to 0G very easily, much easier than I really thought I would.
As he will explain later,
a human being adapts to this situation. I recalled the fact that I had this little hand camera once, and I had taken a picture, and I wanted to do something with a switch immediately, and it just seemed natural at that time, after I'd been weightless for, I guess it was a half hour or 45 minutes, I had acclimated to this rapidly enough that it just seemed perfectly natural. Rather than put the camera away, I just put it out in midair and let go of it and went ahead with the switch position here and reached back to the camera and went on with the word.
telemetry equipment relays his blood pressure back to Canaveral. 120/80, perfection itself for a man half his age. An excellent pulse of 86. He's covering 3.5 miles in space with each heartbeat. Passing over Australia, Glenn sees clearly the bright lights that the city of Perth has turned on to greet him. He chats with friend Gordo Cooper, assigned to the Muchea tracking station.
That was sure a short day.
Again, Friendship 7?
That was about the shortest day I've ever run into.
Time passes rapidly, huh?
Yes, sir.
Halfway across the Pacific, heading for his first sunrise, he runs into a weird sight, as he will later describe it.
Because a lot of the little things that I thought initially were stars were actually a bright yellowish green, about the size and intensity as looking at a firefly on a real dark night.
They did not appear to be emanating from the capsule. They appeared to have even distribution across on each side of the capsule. And we saw it on all three orbits, about the same length of time at each sunrise. They were very luminous, a yellowish green color. And as George Ruff, our psychiatrist, listened to this and said, "What did they say, John?"
Scientists will kid Glenn about his fireflies, and they'll remain a mystery until 3 months later, when they will suddenly and accidentally be cleared up. But just now, as he flies over Mexico, a serious problem grabs his attention. His automatic controls, which he had counted on to maintain attitude while he carried on various tests and experiments, have gone out of whack. The spacecraft keeps drifting to the right, like an automobile with its front wheels out of alignment. Glenn is forced to take charge and use fly-by-wire, a semi-automatic operation that keeps him from other tasks and uses up precious hydrogen peroxide fuel he will need later for re-entry. Now passing over Cape Canaveral, John Glenn has completed one full orbit. His mood is supremely serene. But down below at Cape Canaveral, Mercury Control is deeply worried for him. A signal coming from the capsule by telemetry is warning of trouble in the broad face of the capsule, against which Glenn is resting his back and which he cannot see. Directly behind him, like a jack-in-the-box, is packed the landing bag. It's meant to pop out just before splashdown, pushing ahead of it the remains of the heat shield, so that both together will cushion the shock of impact. But the signal warns that the landing bag has deployed or pushed out prematurely. If so, the heat shield may also have been pushed loose, that fiberglass honeycomb that serves to absorb the terrible 3,000-degree heat built up by friction during re-entry. Without a heat shield, the capsule will melt. The pilot will be incinerated to ashes. What to do? A call goes to Al Shepard, capsule communicator.
Capcom, TM.
Go ahead, Jim.
Roger, you do have a valid impact bag signal up at this time.
A valid what?
Impact bag signal. Segment 51 is indicating a valid signal.
Okay, let me check it out.
Roger.
In other words, you should have no signal at this time.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
The important aspect here would be that he keeps the landing bag off until he needs it.
Mercury Control decides not to worry Glenn at the moment, but simply to ask him to make sure that the landing bag deploy switch is properly in off position.
Will you confirm that your landing bag switch is in the off position, over?
That is affirmative. Landing bag switch is in the center off position.
But at Canaveral, the discussion goes on. How best to cope with a seemingly defective heat shield?
What's going to happen when we cut the retro straps loose?
Now, we know also that the retro pack will hold the heat shield up.
This is Al Shepard. How much does the bag have to displace before this limit switch is actuated?
I couldn't answer that one, Al. I don't know.
Well, if the straps are going to hold the goddamn thing in there, it's not going to move anyway, is it?
That's right. It shouldn't move, see. I would assume that it would be tight enough that it would hold it up there. See, Al, we might get in trouble the other way by keeping that pack on.
Yeah, but you're in a hell of a lot less trouble with the pack on than you are with the bag off.
This is right.
Yeah, we want to be damn sure on this one, Ed, because if that lining bag comes down, it's disastrous, whereas it's not disastrous if we make a re-entry with the retros on.
The tension builds. As John races past Hawaii for the last time, he's finally told about the problem. A test is made to check yet again on whether the heat shield is out of its proper position or whether the trouble signal being received is wrong.
Friendship 7, we have been reading indication on the ground on segment 51, which is landing bag deploy. We suspect this is an erroneous signal. However, Kate would like you to check this by putting the landing bag switch in the auto position and seeing if you get a light. Do you concur with this? Over.
Okay, if that's what they recommend, we'll go ahead and try it. Are you ready for it now?
Affirmative, when you're ready.
Roger. Negative. In automatic position, I do not get a light, and I'm back in the off position now. Over.
Roger, that's fine. In this case, we'll go ahead and the re-entry sequence will be normal.
Probably the signal is defective, but there's no way of making sure. At Canaveral, Chris Kraft and his crew reach a decision. They want to ensure that the heat shield will not be torn off as a result of this trouble. They order Glenn to keep the retro package in place over the heat shield, even after he has fired the retro rockets to slow down for re-entry. They hope that the metal straps that fasten the retro package across the heat shield will keep the heat shield from falling off. Next, Glenn contacts Wally Schirra, up ahead in California, who will give him the final countdown to fire the retro rockets.
John, leave your retro pack on through your pass over Texas. Do you read?
Roger.
Around the world, hundreds of millions wait breathlessly before TVs and radios as the two astronauts talk between Earth and orbit. Glenn checks that the capsule is set exactly right for retrofire, that the green panel lights confirm the equipment is ready. A controller starts the countdown, and Schirra joins in.
4, 3, 2, 1, fire. Retro fire. Roger. Retros are firing.
Oh, Roger, baby.
Feels like I'm going back toward Hawaii.
Don't do that. You want to go on the East Coast.
The three retro rockets have fired at the prescribed 5-second intervals, slowing the capsule enough to make it lose momentum and start settling toward the Earth. But then, as it plows back into the thick atmosphere, friction builds up outside the capsule, toward the expected 3,000 degrees. Mercury Control at Canaveral keeps warning Glenn.
This is Texas Capcom Friendship 7. We are recommending that you leave the retro package on through the entire re-entry. Do you read?
This is Friendship 7. What is the reason for this? Do you have any reason? Over.
This is the judgment of Cape Flight.
Glenn, now flying backward, lies helpless on his contour couch. He hears loud thumping noises behind him and sees fiery debris sail past his window. Telemetry signals reveal at Cape Canaveral the quickened heartbeat under his surface control, from 86 beats per minute to 132. Then, silence, as the heat and friction barrier block out all radio signals. At Mercury Control, Al Shepard calls over and over.
Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? 7, this is Cape. Do you read? Over. Friendship 7, this is Cape. Do you read? Over.
Then, finally, from a capsule falling free to Earth.
Loud and clear. How me?
Roger, reading you loud and clear. How you doing?
Oh, pretty good. My condition is good, but that was a real fireball, boy. I had great chunks of that retro pack breaking off all the way through.
At 28,000 feet, the drogue chute is exploded out and opens. Then the main parachute.
Main chute is on green. Chute is out in reef condition at 10,800 feet and beautiful chute. Chute looks good. On O2 emergency, and the chute looks very good.
To a slow 5-minute descent to the South Atlantic, hitting the water 4 hours, 55 minutes, and 23 seconds after launch. He waits patiently as the destroyer Noah cuts 6 miles across the water. 17 minutes later, it comes alongside and hoists capsule and pilot aboard together. 5 pounds and 5 ounces lighter than the man who entered the capsule at dawn. Infinitely wiser now, and far more renowned, John Glenn comes out on the deck into the glow of his 4th sunset of the day. He's shown that man has a definite role in space, because without him, the capsule might never have come home. And he's proved the worth of Project Mercury. In Washington, 250,000 spectators stand in drenching rain as John Glenn is paraded from the White House to Capitol Hill, where, in a signal honor, he addresses a joint session of Congress.
Our efforts today and what we've done so far are but small building blocks on a very huge pyramid to come. Questions are sometimes raised regarding the immediate payoffs from our efforts. What benefits are we gaining from the money spent? Well, the real benefits we probably cannot even detail. They're probably not even known to man today. But exploration and the pursuit of knowledge have always paid dividends in the long run, usually far greater than anything expected at the outset.